Bravo, for health coverage, this is going to be something that is managed mostly by insurance companies, and it exists to enforce the individual mandate. What this does is this proves to the IRS that every individual has met their required insurance commitment on a monthly basis. If an individual person does not have insurance, then there would be a penalty assessed against that individual person. On the 1095-C form, this is where the employer provided health insurance coverage, and really this exists to enforce the employer mandate, which means that the employers all have to be able to prove to the IRS that all applicable employees were offered health insurance and that it was accepted and at what levels. Again, if there's no offer of coverage, then there's a penalty associated with it. A few common terms and acronyms when we go through it. I won't read this whole slide, but really it's just a matter of, you're going to hear me use terms like an ALE, an applicable large employer, more than 50 full-time employees, which would then include full-time equivalents. You're also going to hear us talk about an aggregated applicable large employee group. And if we take a look at the example, for instance, you may have a 500 employee company who then owns a second company of only 25 employees. However, that aggregated ALE group would still have a responsibility to report on all 525. A full-time employee is identified or classified as somebody who has worked more than 30 hours a week or 130 service hours per month. And then an FTE, full-time equivalent, would be if you were to take the monthly hours of all non-full-time employees and divide that by 130, essentially how many full-time employees would your part-timers equate to? So if you had 2 part-time employees each working 15 hours a week, that would be the same as 1 full-time employee. If you hit 50 full-time employees, then you have an obligation to be able to report as an applicable large employer. Now, as we've had conversations over the last couple of years with corporations, what we're finding is that the first question that really needed to be answered is who is going to be responsible for meeting this reporting requirement. And what we have found is that it has fallen squarely in the hands of most HR and benefits organizations. Now, while they are responsible, what they really need to do is work more from a project management perspective to coordinate the efforts of both internal teams as well as external teams. Internally, there's going to be data residing with tax operations potentially, accounts payable, finance, information technology may be involved, both from a security perspective as well as from a reporting perspective to be able to pull the necessary data outside of existing systems. Outside of the company, the HR or benefits folks are most likely having to work with their benefit or payroll providers, perhaps their insurance broker or a COBRA provider, some other sort of organization in which they may currently have much of the information that is necessary to be able to complete the applicable forms. Now, when we take a look at filling out the Form 1095-C, this is going to be the document that will provide each full-time employee with proof that they were provided affordable care through their employer throughout the year. Every full-time employee will have to receive one of these this year, very similar to a W-2. Now, for those of you who are very familiar with this form, you have probably seen this. I know personally I've been staring at this form for almost 2 years now. It has caused me nightmares. At the same time, know that it can be found out on the IRS website, and the instructions as well are relatively straightforward for what information goes into which boxes. A key point that I want to pull out in this form is really to discuss what we refer to as Part 2, lines or rows 14, 15, and 16. The reason that I want to call this out is because there's a lot of confusion in the industry or in the market about how do I find this information, how do I determine this information, and where does it go? I know some organizations have tried to be able to work with an outsourcing type of solution to be able to have somebody else figure out these codes. However, at the end of the day, this is really a decision that has to be made at the business level to be able to identify what were the coverage levels that were provided to the employees. If it wasn't provided to the employees, what was the reason why not? And then finally, what was the employee share of the premium? This information is most likely very closely tied within the walls of your organization, keeping in mind that when you were going to, if somebody was attempting to be able to outsource this, this is most likely going to be the place where there are going to be the penalties associated from the IRS. And that's an enormous risk to be able to hand that off to somebody who chances are has less accurate access or information from your data than you would yourself. So then to continue on, now that we've got a 1095-C in the hands of every employee, the next piece we need to be able to do is what's referred to as an authoritative transmittal. Basically, this is the proof sent to the IRS to be able to provide the information necessary in the format required to be able to get the IRS the proof that, yes, you did meet all of your requirements. Keeping in mind that a significant portion of the funding for the Affordable Care Act is going to come from penalties assessed for noncompliance. Part of the reason why this is so complex is because it needs to be this complex in order to be able to, A, get all the information, and B, understand that if it's not complied with, there are going to be significant penalties, which will then help to fund the program itself. So when we were talking about what those codes were, I'm just going to take a brief minute here. I won't go through and read all of them, but when there's a lot of confusion about the codes, really what we need to take a look at is answering the questions for line 14 and for line 16. Line 14 really asks the question, what type of coverage was offered? And while that may seem daunting when you're looking at options 1A through 1I, as we have conversations with most employers, what we find is that there is a high percentage of them that would be qualified as 1E, as an echo, where minimum essential coverage was provided, a minimum value offered to the employee, as well as being offered to the spouse and dependents. So when you take a look at breaking down exactly what these are, the determination of what code needs to go into which box can really be simplified by just understanding what the codes stand for. Then on line 16 would be what we refer to as the safe harbor code. And this is why you would be able to sit here and say, well, I did not offer coverage to this employee, so then the question is, what was the reason? So for instance, you may have a need for working with a 2D or 2 delta, in which an employee is in a limited non-assessment period, for instance, a waiting period. Your corporate policy may have something in place where an employee is not offered coverage until 90 days from their start of employment. So you would need to be able to identify that, yes, this person was an employee, however, they were not offered coverage on line 14, and our justification for that on line 16 is because they were in a waiting period. So you're able to explain in this form to the government when coverage was offered, when it was not offered, and if it's not offered, why not? So when we take a look at the 1095-C, really what we want to do here is understand that the purpose is to enforce the employer responsibility. The due dates are the same as 1095-Bs. What you're going to find is that when it comes to the due dates, at the end of January is when all forms need to be sent in the mail to employees. And then when it comes to the transmittal of the information to the IRS, what you will find is that if you're doing this via a paper copy, the deadline for sending paper, and this would be only if you have less than 250 employees, the deadline for sending paper to the IRS is by the end of February. Or if you're doing an electronic transmittal, the deadline for the electronic transmittal is the end of March. So really when we take a look at the 3 parts of the 1095-C, Part 1 is the information about the employee and the employer. Part 2, those lines 14, 15, and 16 we discussed a moment ago, really review the monthly information about what was offered and what was covered, including the type of coverage in the safe harbor code. And then Part 3 is information about covered individuals, most specifically about additional dependents, including their Social Security numbers, as well as the months in which they were offered coverage, not offered coverage, and or any other information about the dependents themselves. So next we need to ask the question, why should we care about this now? Well, one of the things that we've been facing through the course of this year is that as we look across the United States, the estimate currently is that there is about 320,000 applicable large employers that are required to report for tax year 2015. And while this is considered a good faith year, The good faith here really only means that as long as you make an attempt to be able to get information to the employees as well as send the information to the IRS, if there are any inaccuracies, there will not be any penalties assessed for this tax year 2015. However, the requirement does not give an acceptance if neither of those attempts are made. So everybody's required to file. Penalties can only be avoided if that good faith effort is made. Something else to consider is that there's currently a limited number of viable vendors that can handle these reporting requirements. Over the course of the last several months, I have seen the tone and the information within email requests for additional details from our company change in tone. Several months ago, people were asking, are you going to be able to assist us with Affordable Care Act reporting? Today, when I get emails of that nature, the emails are more in the phrase of, are you still accepting clients or have you closed your books for the year? And what we're finding is that there are many competitors in the industry who at this point in the game have either decided to stop taking on new customers or stop selling, or have even had to make changes in the offerings of what they say they're going to be able to do. And obviously this directly impacts both your employees and your business. So there's really three significant factors that we need to consider in the timeline here at the end. First thing we need to look at is the human resource obligations and responsibilities because, you know, as luck would have it, none of your additional responsibilities have been removed from your plate. We also need to take a look at an operational approach to implementation. This is a software solution, and even in working with Sovos, it is going to be a software solution available, which means we need to figure out how do we implement, and then understand the process and who needs to be involved. Earlier this year, January of 2015, the IRS was encouraging everybody to voluntarily report. Come January 2016, everything is required and statement deliveries to employees by January 31. Today, we're sitting at the very end of September. Thursday comes the 1st of October, and we're looking at a deadline of about 4 months left to be able to have everything done, compiled, completed, and out to the employees. So when we look at the year-end obligations, how does that stack up? Well, your Q4 responsibilities typically still include things such as finalizing year-end payroll, performing annual reviews, any sort of an open enrollment period, year-end audits, and potentially any other business initiatives or projects that you may have been working on through the course of the year. So as we go into the final and fourth quarter of the year here, really what we've got is less than 100 business days now remaining to position your organization for a successful implementation and meeting these obligations this year. From an implementation timeline, if we break that into a couple of bite-sized chunks, really we have the purchasing process up front, trying to be able to research various options, perhaps selecting a preferred vendor, and then going through the contracting process. Next, we would need to go through some level of technical onboarding. There's going to be project planning or project management, data management, and being able to identify all the necessary pieces to fill out the forms, testing the software solution to ensure that everything is coming out accurately, and then deploying it. And then finally, any level of training that needs to be done on the software, any data solicitation for information that may be missing from employees or from providers, as well as we need to make sure we continue to monitor the regulations put out by the IRS. So now if we take a quick look at the ACA reporting process, what does this really kind of physically look like to get the information from point A to point B? As we've discussed, we need a solution to be able to pull data from multiple data sources, whether that's your HRIS system, time and attendance, payroll, benefits, other file sources, perhaps a CROBA provider, and then all of that information needs to be able to pull into one central filing system to be able to make sure that the right data gets into the right boxes on the 1095 forms. Moving that to the upper left-hand corner here, once we have that data compiled, now we need to be able to put it into some sort of an ACA reporting engine. That reporting engine obviously needs to be able to work within a compliance scenario. Some people are trying to be able to figure out how do I monitor this myself, or do I have somebody else monitoring it to ensure that every time there is a change that the reporting tool that I'm using is also up to date? Then you can see to the right, ultimately what we need to do is we need to print and mail forms to the employees as well as the transmittal to the IRS. An additional capability of an ACA reporting tool is the solicitation piece there at the bottom. As many of you may already know, there are some requirements to be able to go out and gather or collect information either from current employees or perhaps former employees, and there are some requirements or guidelines around how many times you have requested the information, how you have requested the information, what dates, and whether or not you've heard back. All of that needs to be tracked as well to be able to ensure that if audited, you can show that you have done your due diligence to be able to attempt to get all the necessary details from all of the employees that you need to report on. The reason that we know this tax information reporting process so well is because it is very, very similar to what we've already been doing for the last 30 years with the 1099 process. Running it through a 1099 reporting engine, being able to transmit to the IRS, print and mail forms, and also be able to conduct backup withholding, which currently is not part of the Affordable Care Act, but is part of the tax information reporting process. So when talking to or looking to Sovos for a solution, this really is not about a solution that we have built from scratch for this year just for Affordable Care Act reporting. This is really about leveraging something that we've already been doing for 30 years in software platforms that have already been meeting these requirements that we have simply tweaked or modified to be able to meet the needs for the ACA. One additional piece to consider that many people aren't even talking about yet is an understanding of what I refer to as this feedback loop. You can see the penalties and corrections there at the bottom. The reason that this is important is that many people are thinking that the Affordable Care Act reporting is simply a once I'm done, I'm finished for that year type of a transaction. The challenges that we understand from tax information reporting experience is that it is really just the beginning of a rolling 3-year process. So for example, in tax information reporting, you're collecting information this year to be able to report on in January and March of next year. However, later in the year, you will then receive a notice for any inaccuracies or corrections that are necessary, which then means you need to be able to transmit a correction update to the IRS. And if that correction update doesn't take care of or fix the errors, then the following year, now the 3rd year, you're having to be able to withstand or survive an audit and or try to be able to abate penalties. So this really becomes a rolling 3-year process, of which this is simply the 1st year. To simplify this, really what we do is we break this process into 3 identifiable segments. What we want to be able to do is identify what are your source systems, where are you getting the information, how are you consolidating or mapping the data, on a controls and compliance area, how are you taking care of the research, how are you managing your plan year, what is your software and your security to be able to manage all the information, and then finally, what are your outputs? Distribution by print, including postage, doing any sort of testing or reprints, as well as corrections or solicitations. What we work with at Sovos is we have a product referred to as TaxPort ACA. What this graphic represents is that to the far left-hand side, we're going to be able to take the data from your data sources and then be able to map that into the TaxPort ACA environment. From within that environment, because it is a SaaS solution, the compliance research will continue to be conducted by our team. We'll be able to keep the software updated and ensure that every time you log in or anything that is transmitted, it will be up to date with the most recent changes in any sort of a reporting requirement. You'll also notice that the solicitation portion is built within the tool itself, as well as that feedback loop I was discussing for tracking penalties or corrections. All of that can be functional within the TaxPort ACA solution. And then finally, to the right, your transmittals to the IRS, as well as your printing of forms, again, all part of TaxPort ACA. At the end of the day, the purpose of this solution is to really be able to help you hit what we have identified as the 3 primary goals when we're talking to corporations about their ACA requirements. First of all, they're looking for some level of efficiency, either due to a manpower issue or an uncertainty issue or trying to be able to just figure out how to scale. Many times then they're also looking for risk mitigation, want to make sure that we're compliant with all the filing requirements, as well as trying to avoid all applicable penalties. And then ultimately as well, the employee experience. Remember, as these employees are receiving their 1095-Cs, they will need that document in order to be able to submit that with their Form 1040 form when they file their own taxes for that year. If for some reason the information that they're filing is inaccurate, they are also potentially at risk for getting audited and or for facing penalties or fines associated with the individual mandate. So the employee experience as well is a very, very important piece of the goals associated with accurate reporting. So when it comes to those outputs, let's take a little bit deeper look at the print functionality as well as the IRS transmittal. The statement delivery, and the reason that we're going through this is some people saying, well, do I want to outsource the print or do I want to do it in-house? Keep in mind the statement delivery must be first-class postage. We do need to make sure that because we're handling PII or PH hire, we want to ensure it is a secure process. We definitely don't recommend doing what we refer to as print parties, where we just run them off on the laser printer and everybody sits around and stuffs envelopes. Also keep in mind there's a specific deadline. This has to be done on time. And in the event that an organization is looking for electronic statements, there needs to be some level of measurement and tracking for whether the employees opted in or opted out for receiving electronic documents. An additional service that is provided by Sovos is that whenever we go through our printing process, we also run all of the addresses up against the National Change of Address Database, the NCOA, in order to be able to identify if that address has changed or a forwarding address has been filled out within the last 12 months. And if so, then we will update the information on the envelope prior to it entering the U.S. Postal Service, which is then going to help you greatly reduce any level of return mail that would come back to your desk. A couple of common terms and acronyms when it comes to the electronic filing. First of all is to understand the AIR system. It stands for ACA information reporting. This is the submission of how we get the information directly to the IRS. And publication 5165 is the publication that has listed out all of the requirements for this transaction. These publications are now final. They've only been final for, I believe, the last 3 to 4 weeks based on some meetings I was in about a month ago, but it is final now. So the way that Sovos is going to be able to meet these requirements is when it comes to the 1095-C or 1094-C, we will be using the AIR system for all electronic filing. The key is that this is being delivered in XML format, and every 1095-C submission, whether paper or electronic, must be accompanied with a 1094-C transmittal. So as you can see here, even if we have one parent company and multiple subsidiaries, somebody still has to be identified as the authoritative transmittal, and all of the information must be sent to the IRS, both for the parent and the subsidiaries. So if we take a little bit deeper look at that authoritative transmittal, this is really where some people are starting to recognize the complexity associated with that filing to the IRS. If an organization does decide they want to do it on their own, it will require them to register for a TCC, or Transmitter Control Code. It will also mean that they have to be able to produce the XML files per the IRS publication 5164 we were just talking about, and then submit via the requirements 5165. What's interesting is that the sample to the right there, while very small, it's a sample of the XML code that is necessary for filing on a single individual. My understanding is that if you were to print out the code necessary per employee, it ends up being almost 4 pages of printed code per person to get the information correct in the IRS format. Also, there is a requirement where the maximum file size that can be sent is a 100 megabyte file size, which is about 15,000 records. So if you have less than 15,000 employees, that's not a concern. More than 15,000 employees means that there has to be a method to be able to break your transmittal into multiple transmittals and still have them reference each other. Now, when it comes to that XML format, fortunately, Solvus has already been here before. We're experienced in working with new IRS data systems, as well as working within the XML outputs. For example, in the top right, you can see we have an FATCA XML schema. Currently, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, FATCA, requires transmittals via XML format, as well as many of our international filing requirements are XML, whether we're doing Canadian slips, Puerto Rican forms, many of the direct states, and also FATCA require transmittals via XML. And again, we're experienced in reporting to the IRS for the last 30 years. One of the things I'd like to make sure and recommend is that if you're on the call here with us today and you've not yet engaged in conversations with your IT security team, you may want to add that down to your list of things to start having conversations around. Most IT security teams become a little bit edgy when they find out that there's going to be personally identifiable information, or PHI, that is going to be outside of the company walls. We'll be more than happy to have conversations with your IT security team or provide them with detailed information about the levels of security that we go through in order to be able to protect that information of your most important asset, your employees and team members. So when it comes to the solution that we've got with TaxPort ACA, this offering that we have is a fully outsourced service, and it solves problems for about 95% of the corporations out there. It's really a very straightforward three-step process in which we're going to be able to provide you access to load your data, be able to pull the information straight in, then be able to fix your data, in which there's going to be some capabilities around identifying errors or validating that all the information is filled in correctly, and then ultimately sending the data both in a print format to our secure printers to then be able to get the forms to your employees, as well as sending data to the IRS at the appropriate time in March. It is very straightforward and easy to learn. It will literally walk you through each step, and it is a complete service that you will be able to access via a browser to be able to get the information from your system to ours, and then ultimately to the IRS. What we've got here is just a sample screenshot of that initial login page, and as you can see, it is literally import your information, review and edit, and then send the information. From a usability and support perspective, we also have a full team of people here who have been working with tax information and reporting requirements for the last several years. What I'm showing you here are actual screenshots of our application that is available, as well as the various records, reports, as well as the 1095-C form that you can view within the application and or then print off locally or send to us for printing. At the end of the day, this is really about letting technology do the heavy lifting. You have the data, you have the ability to pull the information together. Our technologies can then partner with you to support you for being able to send out the information to the employees and to the IRS. So really at this point, we're going to have one final polling question, which Brady Hagstrom is going to be able to bring up here to empower you to be able to answer.
So on your right in your WebEx Event Center, you should be able to see the polling question. Please go ahead and answer that. An additional reminder that the Q&A section is over there on the right as well. Please feel free to enter in any questions that you have. We have a number of them right now, so we do have some time left in this hour, so I will go ahead and begin asking Ray some of the questions. Ray, do I have an obligation if I have more than 100 employees but not are all full-time?
Good question. The answer is if you have more than 50 full-time equivalents, then yes, you would have an obligation to file. Really what it comes down to is whether or not you have, for instance, even if you only have, of that 100, if you have 30 that are full-time, but then the other 70 are half-time, those 70 that are half-time would then add up to an additional 35 full-time equivalents. So with your 30 full-times plus your 35 full-time equivalents, you would now be at a total of 65 full-time equivalent employees, which exceeds the number of 50, which then would require you to file both forms to the employees as well as with the IRS.
Thank you, Ray. Just a reminder, the polling question is still open. We only have a few minutes left before that does close. The second question related to the one you just answered, this is from one of our attendees. Just want to confirm only full-time employees and part-time, averaging 30 hours a week, are required to receive a 1095. We do not need to provide to non-eligible employees. Is that correct?
On this one, I'm going to need to, thinking on this, I'd highly recommend that you seek some legal counsel on this one, because what I do know is that the requirements for being able to report are met if you have in excess of 50 full-time employees. And then it becomes a matter of whether or not coverage was offered or accepted by those full-time or part-time employees. So it's an area that I'm going to hesitate to answer on, because you could have a legal business decision that needs to be made in there regarding the offerage of coverage combined with their full-time or part-time status.
Thanks, Ray. Can you explain the difference between 1A and 1E? I'm thinking this relates to the determination codes. We offer minimum essential coverage providing minimum value offered to employee and offered to their dependents, but we also offer a 50% employee contribution.
All right. Again, I'm going to need to go back and say that I cannot offer legal advice. And I went back and I'm looking at the slide. 1A means that the employee received a qualifying offer. 1E means minimum essential coverage was provided for employee, spouse, and dependents. I can't identify the minimum essential coverage. It just says an employee received a qualifying offer, so I don't know that I can identify a legal definition between 1A and 1E. The primary difference that I see is whether or not that qualifying offer means minimum essential coverage. Sorry, I can't help you any more on that one.
Thanks, Ray. Are you able to accept two different files, one file from our HRIS system and another from our health vendor?
Yes, we are. And in fact, that's the most common way in which we receive the information. What you'll be able to do within TaxPort ACA is that you will upload both of those files, and then the information will be mapped according to a common identifier. In most cases, that common identifier is going to be the Social Security number. And since you will have the Social Security number in both of those systems, we will be able to identify this information from this form or from this file applies to John Smith, and the information from this file applies to John Smith, and then it will map accordingly to the appropriate boxes on the form, both for printing as well as for transmittal to the IRS.
Thanks, Ray. We have a few more questions in regards to specific coverage and minimum essential coverage offerings. We're not going to answer those questions. That is considered tax advice, as Ray has talked about in some of the previous questions. We do have one more question, however. What is the requirement for union employees if they're covered by the union?
Okay. There is a specific requirement for unions, and if it is covered by the union, there's actually two different pieces. One, there is a requirement for the union to be able to act as the insurer. So the union is most likely going to be filing a 1095B as in Bravo on behalf of the employee, or actually they'll be sending that to the employee, and then they will also have to transmit to the IRS the fact that this is the coverage that was accepted. then there is a little bit different requirement when it comes to the employer, in which they're going to need to be able to identify that these employees were covered, but they were covered by a third party. So again, I'm going to lead you back toward legal tax advice in order to be able to identify how that works with the labor union. And in fact, what I would probably recommend, the conversations that I have seen or have had with other organizations here, is that because the union is going to be working with multiple employers, chances are they have something that is standardized that will be able to assist you in being able to make sure you get all the information that you need, as well as the information that they need. So I would absolutely recommend talking to your union representative to be able to ensure that you're both on the same page.
Thanks, Ray. And the last question, I believe you've alluded to it and I've read about it. What does good faith effort mean to the IRS?
Great question. When it comes to good faith effort, the information that we have seen is really a two-part good faith effort. You need to meet the requirements for, first of all, filling out a form, the document itself, and sending it to the employees. The second part of a good faith effort is that there has to be a transmittal in the appropriate format to the IRS. Now, if you're less than 250 employees, you can do that by generating a 1094C form to be able to then send in the mail, or if you're going to be doing it electronically, then it has to be done in the AIR format and transmitted to the IRS from an organization that has a TCC code. So really, our understanding of good faith effort means that A, you generated a form and got it to the employees, and B, you got the information to the IRS either via paper or electronically. But what happens is, by making that good faith effort, they will then not hold you accountable in the event that there are errors. So for instance, if there are errors in lines 14 or 16, if there's errors in the codes, or there's a Social Security number that's missing, or there's a misspelled name, those types of errors that would normally trigger penalties will not trigger penalties for this first year, because you made that good faith effort of getting a form to the employee and then transmitting to the IRS either via paper or electronic.
Great. Thank you, Ray. That does conclude the Q&A section and also our presentation here today. We will be able to give you a few minutes back in your hour. I will be distributing the PowerPoints and the presentation later this week, and we will be having an expert follow up with anyone that did indicate they wish to be contacted via the polling mechanism. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today and spending a little bit of time learning about implementing an Affordable Care Act solution with Public Compliance today. Have a great rest of your day, and take care.